Welcome to JHart Modelworks. In this episode, we're going to focus on the chassis and suspension for the Tamiya 1/24th scale Honda NSX. Welcome to my workbench. Let's get started. While I'm working on this chassis, someone pointed out that we hit 500 subs last week. That is so freaking cool. You guys are so awesome, and I want to say thanks to each and every one of you that subscribes and comes and watches my videos each week. If you've seen the engine video, you've already seen this chassis painted. But that was already a long video, and I really feel that the chassis is more in line with the suspension than with the engine, so I thought it would fit better here. We're just going to go ahead and cut the chassis off the sprue with our spade nippers, and then we're going to go ahead and clean all these sprue points up with a 400 grit UMP thinny sander. We're going to prime the chassis with some Stylo Res Gray primer. I've mounted the chassis to the top of a water bottle just using a blob of blue tack. This tends to work out really nicely for chassis painting. I like to paint the inside of the chassis just in case some parts are visible after everything is assembled. Give that about 10 minutes to dry, and it's time for coat number 2 on the primer. Time to paint. We're going to base the whole chassis in semi-gloss black from Zero Paints. There's several parts that need to stay semi-gloss black, then the rest gets some aluminum. In theory, I could just spray these areas that need the black, but black gives a really good base for metallics, so I'm basing the whole chassis in this black first. We're going to finish the black base off with coat number 2. Again, we did give 10 minutes between coats. This is lacquer paint. I want to make sure I give it plenty of time to gas off so that we run less risk of damaging our plastic. We gave the black base a couple of hours to dry. Then we masked everything off that needed to stay black. And now we're going to spray about 2 coats of Tamiya LP38 flat aluminum. Another 10 minutes have passed, and now we're going to spray our second coat of the flat aluminum to finish this off. And here's our finished chassis. We did go in with our mechanical pencil and some Vallejo silver and just picked off some bolts here and there just to finish off some of the detail painting. All the parts for the suspension were cut off and cleaned up. I'm not going to go through all the parts, just going to show a few examples here. When cutting off small parts, I often try to leave one sprue point attached. I usually try to get one in an area that won't interrupt paint if it's at all possible. This makes it easier to mount on sticks for painting. And I also, if I can, I try to keep the part number attached as well. So you'll see, for instance, on this part here, I'm going to do some really strange cuts and leave a long bit, but I'm just trying to keep that part number attached. When cleaning up these small parts, it's usually good to try to make sure you get your finger back behind the part on the other side of the sander so that when you're pressing down with the sander, you're not pressing just against the part, you're really putting your pressure against the finger so you don't snap the part in half and send like half of it flying across the room. Since most of these parts are going to be some form of metallic, I figured I'd cheat and just use some of this UMP gloss black primer. It's not really a gloss, it's at best a semi-gloss, but it's not as flat as the regular black Stynylrez. This wasn't my best idea. Stynylrez UMP is, in my opinion, the best acrylic primer on the market. But somewhere around 6 months after the bottle's opened, you start having issues with small clumps forming in the bottle that, I mean, they're so small they can still come out and get into the airbrush and clog things up and cause all sorts of problems. This happens with all acrylic primers, by the way, not just Stynylrez. Normally, you can solve this by just shaking the crap out of the bottle and then straining it through a 190 micron filter. But this bottle is more than a year old. I bought it months before the pandemic hit and before shipping prices just became too high to order from UMP. As such, most of the primer didn't make it through the strainer at all, and I still got a really rough surface on a few parts. Like anything that had real flat surfaces kind of had some trouble. I had to strip the parts. I did it while they were still wet and just resprayed them with some regular Stynylrez black. The bottle was almost empty anyhow, so I just threw the rest out. Once the primer had cured, it was time for some paint. Of all the parts the instructions say to paint semi-gloss black, this is the only one I'm keeping that way, and I'm going to go ahead and spray this in some LP5 from Tamiya. Several parts are supposed to either be sprayed X11 chrome silver or a combination of chrome silver and flat aluminum. So we're going to start with all the chrome silver parts first. We're going to hit these with some Tamiya LP48 sparkling silver, which is a very similar color. Afterwards, we'll go ahead and mask these off once the paint dries, and we'll hit them with our secondary colors. The front and rear sway bars were supposed to be painted semi-gloss black. That ain't happening. I hit them with some LP48 sparkling silver and followed that up with some LP52 clear red for an aftermarket anodized look. I gave the previous parts a couple of hours to dry, then masked off anything that needed it and sprayed the final color LP38 flat aluminum. There's a lot of very intricate, very fiddly masking involved. It took a lot longer to mask this than it did to paint the parts. With everything painted, there's still some details to do by hand. I decided for the shocks I'm going to paint them to resemble these aftermarket coilovers from KW. So we're going to start with some Vallejo Air medium yellow. Now instead of using a brush for small details like this, a lot of times I will use a mechanical pencil. I just dipped the lead into the paint and used the paint's lead as my point. So I've got a 0.3 millimeter mechanical pencil here. You see I just dip some color on there and I get a lot more control than using a brush. I can really get in and specifically hit just the points that I want to hit. This is also really good for things like rivets and interior buttons. Anything really small that you don't want to risk a brush bending or floating and just getting paint everywhere. With the springs done, we're going to go ahead and paint the purple parts using some of this Vallejo Game Air Alien Purple. When detail painting, I often use these water-based acrylics because if you make a mistake, you can easily just take a wet cotton bud and just wash it off and start over again without making any damage to the actual base paints, especially if you're painting over something like a lacquer. Just water won't touch it. Now for this, royal purple is actually a closer match to the reference photo. You can see I did the lower cap in the royal purple, but looking at it and looking at it in the suspension in a dry fit, it just looked really dark. The alien purple stands out more. I am not a color purist, so to me, if you're using like an exact FS standard paint and it looks wrong, then in my opinion, it's wrong. If you're painting something and in scale it's just too dark, then sometimes you want to change to a brighter color so that something stands out more. A lot of times I'll paint for effect rather than for accuracy. After doing the front shocks, we're going to do the same to the rears. Again, just using the same purple and yellow. Just take your time with this and go gentle. And if you need to, instead just take your wet cotton bud, wipe it off, and start over. With the springs done and set aside to dry, we're going to move on to the sway bars. We're going to go ahead and use some of this Vallejo silver and just paint the connecting points. Now I am going to use I believe this is a 5/0 sable brush on this. Just due to the shape of the connectors and the way they flow and bend, the paintbrush really does help. Now on the first one I went ahead and I masked it, but it really was more of a pain than a help. So on the rear I didn't bother with the masking at all. I just was very careful with the painting. Alright, we're going to start assembly just using some super glue. We're going to set the rear sway bar first, as other parts will block it if you don't. For those of you who haven't seen earlier videos, the tool I'm using to set my super glue is just the back end of a sewing needle with the top half of the eye cut off of it. We're going to set the transaxle in place, and I'm not even going to glue it into that hole. I'm just going to slide it in that hole. Once we set the rear shock and the wheel, we'll actually put some glue on it and slide it in place. A little bit out of frame there. I do that quite frequently in this video. Sorry about that. So we're just going to pull it out slightly and tug it in till it rests against the wheel back. Now we are going to go ahead and put some glue for this other side axle. So I'm going to set that into the transmission. And then when you set your shock, kind of got to fiddle with it a little bit, but just make sure that everything sits into the proper place. It's having a little bit of difficulty getting the wheels to set in. There we go. Job's done, as Paul likes to say. Now we're going to connect the last piece of the exhaust. Put some super glue on each side of the exhaust pipes. Just set that down into place. Make sure everything's sitting flat. Because it's 2 points at 2 different angles, you can actually tilt it in or down and it won't sit flat, so you just got to make sure that you get that flattened out. Now to mount this rear frame piece, there's 3 tabs on each of the wheel uprights, then there's 4 glue points on the chassis itself. So I just kind of hit all of them with some super glue, but it does make it kind of fiddly trying to get this piece to sit right, because you have to hit all 3 holes on each side of the wheel uprights and hit all 3 holes on the other side and get all 4 of the holes to line up. So you just want to make sure that you get it and that everything sits flat, otherwise it's going to look funky. You've got to kind of press that in right there. There we go. There's our rear suspension. All right, now it's time for the front suspension. And this actually builds up as a separate subunit first. So we'll start again with our sway bar. I could actually hold that like a human being. Get some glue on each tip of our sway bar and on our mounting points. You want to make sure you set that on those inside holes. There's 2 sets of holes that look almost identical, and the front ones are for this upper suspension piece. We want to make sure that we line this up the right direction, because those 2 little L shapes at the bottom actually go on the frame. There's some connecting points, but I don't actually put any glue on them. the rest of the assembly actually holds everything in place, so I didn't really feel like I needed to put any glue there. Get everything lined up, and then press it home. You want to make sure you get everything pressed nice and flat. I don't know what these parts are, but there's one on each side. Just set the top, and then you can set that side point. Repeat for the other side. A little glue in the hole. There's that. Now we're going to put our wheel uprights in. There's a little tab in one side that slides into that hole, and then the bottom clicks in around. I had a little bit of problems getting it to click in firmly. Didn't feel like it wanted to go down any further, and I didn't want to press too hard on it. I was afraid I was going to break it. I finally got it to set down in there. And then for this steering cross member, there is an angle to this piece, and you want to make sure that the angle puts the center section pointing down towards the bottom of the car, or it's going to sit wrong and it won't seat in properly. Now, before we mount the whole thing into place, we do need to go ahead and set the front shocks. There's a rectangular hole in the chassis that lines up with the rectangular tab. It doesn't really matter which way you face it. I try to make it so that the ejector pin mark in the springs is less visible. And repeat for the other side. One thing I like about this super glue is it's not instant. The MaxiCure is a little bit slower to dry, so this actually is going to give me a little bit of wiggle room when I go to actually set the main front suspension assembly in place. I'm going to need to wiggle those shocks a little bit, so don't hit these with a CA accelerator. Leave these a little loose for right now. Now it's going to sit right on these two rails, and these, we're just going to put some glue on there. I'm not even going to fiddle with my tool, just put a small blob of glue right there on that strut, because you're not going to see it right on that frame rail. Then the suspension portion is going to have these little channels, and these channels sit right on top of that frame. Little L shapes go towards the center of the car. Trying to get it set right, and my shocks are in the way. Let's go ahead and nudge those a little bit. Put the shocks to the back side of the suspension assembly. finally you can press that home. When it's in all the way and everything's assembled correctly, the suspension piece should just look like it's sitting flat against the chassis of the car. And that's going to wrap it up for the suspension and chassis work. I really like the splash of color from the sway bars and the shocks, and I think it turned out really well. I'm not doing the brakes in this video. The AP Racing brake set from Hobby Design is very detailed, and I think it deserves its own episode. So be sure to catch that video next week, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. Also, feel free to leave comments, feedback, critique, or anything else in the comment section below. I enjoy interacting with all my viewers in the comment section and try to reply to all the comments I receive. If you want to catch future videos, please consider subscribing to my channel and make sure you click the bell notification icon so you can be notified when I upload new videos. As always, thank you for watching, keep modeling, and have a great day.